Talking Gators, but we're also going to talk some classic football. And you know I love that. Here at MarkRogersTV, the voice of college football, we got Will Miles on the line. You can join him. And, of course, David Waters at Gators Breakdown. Will, how's it going today?
It's going well. Thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. And so this is a subject that I can talk about every day, any day for hours and hours and hours, and that's classic college football games. So you've got a podcast that you started with somebody else?
Yeah, so one of my writers over at my site, readandreaction.com, his name's Nick Knudsen. He and I have been writing for a while, and during the off season, we were looking for something to do. And then when COVID hit, we started thinking, well, we might need some content. So we started looking back at some old college football games. He and I had always sort of riffed back and forth about, that game back in 2006, that game back in 2003. Decided to take a little bit closer look, and this podcast is a result of that.
So when people look back at college football or any sport, it generally falls in place with how old they are. So I'm guessing that you're going back to your wheelhouse. You mentioned two games, 03 and 06. What are most of these games in the last 15, 20 years?
Yeah, I mean, the vast majority of them are, though. We look back at Northwestern versus Notre Dame in 1995 is one that we've done recently. And actually, we just recorded one the other night. It hasn't released yet. Georgia versus Penn State in the Sugar Bowl back in 1983. So we are not just hitting up, 2017 Alabama versus Clemson. We are hitting some of the more recent ones, but also some of the ones in the past. The ones that have been released thus far, we looked at Florida, South Carolina in 2006. The Gamecock block game, and then also Miami versus Ohio State, 2003, the Fiesta Bowl with the pass interference at the end. But there was a lot of stuff in both of those games that it's funny that you don't really remember. And then you look back and it's like, wow, if one thing had changed, like we wouldn't have gotten that classic ending, or it would have been a completely different ending based on the way things played out.
So you went all the way back to Todd Blackledge versus Herschel Walker. I remember it well when Penn State won the national championship in 82, 83. And then that Northwestern team, obviously, the Wildcats, that program had been down forever, and they came out of nowhere to go to the Rose Bowl and win the Big Ten, and that was a win they had against Notre Dame. Yeah, good stuff. Got Will Miles on the line talking SEC football, talking national football, classic games. He's got a podcast called 2020 Hindsight. So if somebody just jumps on Google and looks up 2020 Hindsight, should they be okay, or is there a particular place they should go?
Yeah, so the best place to go is you can go to iTunes and search 2020 Hindsight, or if you go to Read and Reaction, if you search Read and Reaction on YouTube, it'll come right up. It's on my YouTube channel there at Read and Reaction.
So what are some of the more interesting things, whether they be nuts and bolts, X's and O's, or players or coaches or anything periphery to the game that you've uncovered that you find interesting?
Yeah, so there were a couple of things in the most recent episodes. In Florida, South Carolina, everybody remembers that Jarvis Moss blocked the field goal for that particular game for the Gators to win, and then the Gators go on and win the national championship back in 2006. What they don't remember, what I didn't remember even being a Gators fan, I didn't even remember it, is that Steve Spurrier, who was the South Carolina head coach at that time, took a deep shot right down the middle with about 20 seconds left. He sort of lulled the defense to sleep, thinking they were going to call a timeout. Then he called a deep shot, completed it down to like the 10 or the 12-yard line, but their left guard had just barely flinched right before the snap. And so 5-yard penalty, they go out and they then have to try to kick the field goal to win the game, and it gets blocked. Chances are Jarvis Moss, it doesn't block that field goal if it's from 28 or 29 yards. And then the other thing is Miami, Ohio State, 2003. You remember Willis McGahee getting his knee injured in that game. You remember Ken Dorsey sort of getting thrown down like a rag doll on the last play. Certainly remember the pass interference. What people don't remember, what I didn't remember, was that Ohio State had completed a 4th and 14 on that same drive with the pass interference. And Krenzel was 7 of 21. The Ohio State quarterback was 7 of 21 for like 110 yards in the entire game. So it was a minor miracle that they converted a 4th down and 14 just to get into position to have that pass interference call. So it's been interesting looking back and sort of seeing those hidden plays that lead to the next play. Same thing, we were looking at was it Nebraska versus Missouri. There were a lot of things that went on in the game where in 1997 where Nebraska kicked the ball basically on a 4th down in the end zone up into their own players' arms. The Missouri quarterback in that game played really, really, really well. And you sort of forget how good Nebraska was, even in 97. I think people remember how good those teams with Tommy Frazier were in 95 and 96. It was sort of fun to see Scott Frost at quarterback, knowing where he is now as the coach at Nebraska, back at his old stomping grounds. So those are sort of the types of things that we talk about on the podcast.
1997 Missouri quarterback, was that Corby Jones?
It was Corby Jones.
And then the Ohio State-Miami game, I remember what could have been called a pass interference play. Ohio State was up by a field goal. They had the ball. They could have possibly run out the clock. There was about 3 minutes left in the game. They completed a pass to Chris Gamble on like a 3rd and 8, 3rd and 9. And both Keith Jackson and Dan Fouts thought it was pass interference. The DB was grabbing him by the shirt, and he caught the ball in bounds. So it could have either been called a first down catch or a pass interference, and there was no replay at the time, and Ohio State punted the ball away, and Miami got a big return, set up the field goal that took it to OT.
Yeah, my co-host Nick Knudsen grew up a Buckeyes fan and then went to Florida, so he's got some weird allegiances. But that one was particularly fun because he had visual evidence. He had a photo for the podcast holding it up of Gamble getting held by the Miami defensive back because, I had to give him a bunch of crap later on when the pass interference came up.
So what did you two determine about the pass interference once you got to see it again and again and again?
Yeah, I think the reality is that it looked weird. So I think he's a homer, so he thought it was clearly pass interference. But I think when we really went back and looked at it, we said, hey, it looked weird. I understand why the official called it pass interference. It's the lateness of the flag that bothered people more than anything, I think, overall, right? Is that Miami was already on the field, already celebrating the national title, and had to sort of regroup and wasn't able to. And that was probably the thing that I think disturbed people who weren't a fan of either team, who just sort of looked at it and said, the late flag, that stinks. And we actually saw it this week in the Packers game. I don't know that it was the pass interference that angered people quite as much as the fact the flag came in late.
So, Will, you've got this limitless, boundless reservoir of games to choose from. So how do you choose them?
Well, so that's actually so right now we just choose them off the cuff. We got a list of like the top 125 games that ESPN had a while back of college football and sort of go through those, and then through things that are our own recollection. But one of the things we do have is we do have a Patreon account, and people who go over there and support us on Patreon, we allow them to help us select the next games we're going to do.
That is very cool. So it's 2020 hindsight. Look it up on iTunes. Again, Will Miles. And who's doing this work with you?
So it's me and my co-host, Nick Knudsen. So he writes over at Read and Reaction, and then he's helping co-host the podcast.
Very cool. And you can also catch Will with David Waters and Gators Breakdown